Hi, this is Jim Swallow. Welcome back to the fourth chapter of the story of how I restored a 1990 Miata and converted it into an electric car. In chapter 3, I discussed how I came up with the color and design scheme of my car, painted it myself, did some body work, and put the body together. In this chapter, we're going to discuss some of the extensive mechanical work that needed to be done on the car, and specifically brake rotors, brake pads, switching out the power steering system for a manual steering system, and finally get the electric motor and transmission coupled together and installed. The first step was getting the car lifted up high enough to get easy access underneath. So I did that by lifting the car with jacks and a come along and suspended it from some sturdy members that ran across the top of the garage. This actually ended up working out pretty well, and the car ended up suspended there for almost a year as further work progressed. Next, after doing some more cleaning up underneath, I attacked the brakes and shock absorbers. There was a lot of surface rust on everything, but mechanically everything seemed to be in pretty good shape. And so I went out and got some new rotors and brake pads, replaced those. I got some new coilover shocks and got them in without too much trouble. In early May of 2019, most of the EV components arrive on a pallet after much anticipation on my part. It weighed about 350 pounds on delivery, and in the boxes were the motor, controller, transmission adapter plate, and most of the electronics. The batteries came later and will be discussed in a later chapter. The motor weighs about 125 pounds, so it wasn't too easy to sling it around. Fortunately, my shop hoist can easily lift it, so I lifted it up onto a table and then transferred it to a bench where it can be comfortably worked on. There's a coupler that goes onto the drive shaft of the motor that the flywheel gets attached to. The big plate that mates the motor with the transmission then gets bolted on. The flywheel gets attached to the coupler. Bolts are torqued to specifications, and then the clutch plate apparatus is bolted in place. The transmission is brought into the shop and gets a final cleaning. Then it's time to connect it to the motor, transmission adapter plate, flywheel, and clutch assembly. I brought these two heavy items down closer to the floor level so that I could have the transmission on a dolly and the motor assembly suspended with my shop hoist so that I could line them up perfectly and bolt them together. It turned out to be a fairly easy alignment and connection. Now the motor and transmission are ready for installation. So now I need to get my motor transmission assembly from the shop floor into the car. This is the spot where we want to get it into, in the front where the gas engine used to be. I figure that the motor transmission assembly weighs about 200 pounds at this point. So I roll it out into the open, and I use a pulley system that is attached to the garage behind the car to slowly pull the assembly past the parking area, up underneath the car, more or less into position. Then I attach the come along you see in the foreground here to the support structure in the ceiling above the car, grip the motor with a choker, attach the come along, and slowly ease it up into position. The transmission is then bolted into place. Electric connections are reattached, as is the speedometer cable. I acquire a gear shift rebuild kit and rebuild the gear shift lever mechanism. The hydraulic clutch system gets refurbished and replaced, and the drive shaft is put back into place. Now I need to create a secure mount for the motor. Although the position of the motor mount for the gas engine is in about the right place, the specifics of how it gets attached needs to be redone. When I get in there and look at it closely, it's fairly obvious that a cradle system with a strap around the top of the motor will be the way to go. So I create a mock-up that I cut out of pieces of plywood and other pieces of wood to show a metal fabricator the shape of what I need for my project. After a couple of weeks, this comes back, and he actually improved on my design a bit by making it much more robust. And now what we have is a cradle underneath, a strap over the top, and we've got our motor mount. So first of all, I have to paint it, of course. The underneath part is close to the ground and gets painted with that rubbery kind of undercoating stuff you can get at the auto supply store. But the strap on the top I can't resist and have to get kind of fancy and actually put a little signature in here. So if someday somebody takes this apart, they know who built it in the first place. I get the whole thing bolted in there securely. We need to be careful that we can overcome the twisting motion of the motor when you step on it and create high torque. I think we've got it here, and we've got it bolted down pretty tightly, so we're ready to go on to the next step. Now that the motor and transmission are installed, mounted, and the drivetrain hooked up, it's time to switch out the power steering mechanism for a manual one. You know, the power steering attaches to a pulley on the motor, and there's a pump there that provides the power for the power steering. And since we don't have a motor and that pulley anymore, we don't have the pump, and the question is whether to go out and get some kind of an electric pump to power the power steering or switch to a manual steering mechanism. And I chose the latter, although it turns out it's very difficult to find manual steering racks for 1990 Miatas, since most of them were made with power. But if you go to a place like Chicago, which has access to a massive number of wrecks, you can pick up a manual steering rack for not too much. And so let's talk about switching that out. Here we are underneath, looking towards the back of the car from the front, and there's the power steering rack. You unbolt the bolts that are holding it in, and given the fact that there isn't a motor or radiator or anything else in front, there's plenty of room and the thing comes out extremely easily. Here's a comparison of the two. You don't really see an awful lot of difference. The manual is on the bottom, and this goes back essentially the reverse of the way the other one was taken out. You bolt it back into place. I put new tie rods on the end, and you bolt the tie rods to the wheel hub on each side. Then you hook up the steering rod into your steering rack, and you're ready to go. So it took me about 6 months to find a manual steering rack and an afternoon to install it. That's it for Chapter 4. Hope you enjoyed it. Next time, we'll discuss the installation and hookup of the electronics, as well as the setup, containment, and wiring of the batteries.